clinical trials to demonstrate effectiveness. It hasn't gone through the same trials for safety, and they're not monitoring side effects. You know, if a drug goes out on the market, then both doctors and patients who find side effects get that information to the FDA, and when the FDA has accumulated enough complaints of side effects, then they determine whether the drug should be removed. None of that is happening with fluoridation. They're not tracking exposure. They're not looking at fluoride levels in our urine, in our blood, in our bones in a systematic way. Doctors are not trained to look at side effects, and we're not doing the studies, and we're not attempting to reproduce the studies that are going on right now in India and China, which have actually produced a litany of problems for people that swallow fluoride in naturally high communities. They're not that high, incidentally. Damage to the bone, damage to the brain, damage to the endocrine system, and so on. This is being documented elsewhere, but we are not doing the obvious studies in this country or any other fluoridated countries. And basically what you're looking at here, if you don't look, you don't find. The absence of studies does not mean the absence of harm. And you get this kind of almost Monty Python-esque results. For example, I was in Dryden, Ontario in April of 2008, and Dryden was considering whether they're going to stop fluoridation, and eventually they did. They stopped. They voted it out. But the chief dental officer for Canada went to that community, and in his talk, he said, I walked down your high street this afternoon, and I didn't see anybody growing horns. And you've been fluoridated for 40 years. And he actually seriously offered this as evidence that fluoridation causes no harm. He didn't see anybody growing horns.
Right.
I mean, this is sheer lunacy.
Well, okay, so there's a I'm going to pull up something here I found on an FDA website in just a second, but I'll parallel something else. Charlie Sheen's ex-wife, a woman named Brooke Mueller, has a drug problem. And she, in a story I read earlier this week, she was trying to go to Mexico to be treated by an FDA unapproved drug. They don't sell it. It's not allowed. It's illegal in the United States, called Ibogaine. And so there are these clinics that are set up to give drug addicts or people who have chemical dependency issues Ibogaine, which apparently disrupts the body's addiction processes and makes it easier to give up drugs. With this, if you take this drug, it'll break up the other drugs, and the FDA won't approve it. And I thought that was so interesting that there's certain drugs that if the FDA says no to, it's not approved. It can't in any way be sold or marketed in the United States as a drug, right? I mean, that's pretty much how the FDA works. So now I go to the FDA's website from a year ago, and they have here, I'm going to read it right here because maybe you already know about this. So it says the FDA orders a halt to the marketing of unapproved single ingredient oral colchicine. This is a drug commonly used to prevent gout, to treat gout flares, to treat a couple other things, but mostly it's for gout. And so it's as soon as they go out of their way to say, if we don't approve it, you can't sell it, you can't market it until we say you can, but except for fluoride. I mean, it's just, but the other people coming on going, well, we've got a product. We'd like to try it out over the next 40 years on the American people. Let's see if it works. They would say absolutely not to, except for fluoride.
Fluoride is the exception for any rule on pollutants or drugs that you can think of. It's a protected pollutant. When the U.S. Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation in 1950, it established such a powerful veil of protection on this practice. It's withstood a rational discussion, rational argumentation, scientific evidence. Everything falls by the wayside in order to protect this practice. And yes, I think the FDA's role in this is despicable. It's total hypocrisy to ban some useful things, and now going overboard in trying to regulate nutrients and so on, which they're doing, and at the same time allow this fluoride, this unapproved drug, to go into the drinking water of over 180 million Americans every day with no supervision, no study, no randomized clinical trials, and so on. And yet, look at the back of your tube of toothpaste, because that is the FDA in action on fluoride, but only on the cosmetic, because they regulate cosmetics as well as food and drugs and stuff. So there you see what they should be doing with water, but they've been kept away by the U.S. Public Health Service, the great big boss. The Department of Health and Human Services has kept the FDA away from doing its job on this issue.
Interesting. Very interesting. The case against fluoride, how hazardous waste ended up in our drinking water, and the bad science and powerful politics that keep it there. So who are the politicians for and against it? Do you have anybody that has come out for you on the you have a national spokesperson politically?
Yes, in fact, you can find a lot about this. There's so much to talk about on that front. If you go to our webpage, Fluoride Alert, fluoride, spell it F-L-U-O, not O-U. Some people get that spelling wrong. Think of flu, so fluoridealert.org. If you go to our webpage, at the top of the webpage, it tells you the recent communities that have stopped fluoridation and links to all the 200 communities that have stopped since 1990. It gives details about how to order our book. It gives more information on all those IQ studies. It gives the professional statement against fluoridation signed by over 3,700 medical, scientific, and environmental professionals. And if you keep scrolling down, you eventually come to a statement by Ralph Nader. And you keep going down, and you'll find the professional perspectives on water fluoridation, 28 minutes, 15 scientists. And if that doesn't convince you to stop, then I don't know what will. Well, perhaps the book will, but it's quicker. It's quicker to watch that videotape than read the book. Now,
but who are the politicians, though? Because, I know Ralph Nader, you mentioned him, but like I said, my grandmother, who was John Birch Society all the way, she would have hated the fact that Ralph Nader was
But this is essentially apolitical. We have people on the right, people on the left, people on the center. Ron Paul announced that if he became president, he would not fund the CDC to promote fluoridation. He thinks that it should be at least a local decision, not a federal imposition. We have the Reverend Andrew Young, former ambassador to the UN, former mayor of Atlanta, and we worked with Martin Luther King Jr. We have Dr. Martin Luther King's daughter, Bernice, and his niece have come out against fluoridation. So, they're particularly concerned in Georgia because they have mandatory fluoridation. They're particularly concerned in Atlanta because they see the CDC is not warning families of color that they're particularly susceptible to fluoride, at least as far as dental fluorosis is concerned. So I think Reverend Andrew Young is very important because his father was a dentist. And for a long time, he supported fluoridation, but he makes the sensible thing. Things change. Science develops. We have more information today than we did 60 years ago, and we have to pay attention to that. Peter Vallone Jr., well-known counselor, New York City, whose father was very famous in New York City, he's introduced a bill in New York City to stop fluoridation. So if you live in New York City and you're listening to this, contact Peter Vallone Jr. or contact your council person and ask them to support Peter Vallone Jr.'s initiative here.
I assume when you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. before, you meant Martin Luther King III, or did you mean MLK was interested in the fluoride issue?
No, not the American hero that got assassinated. No, his daughter.
Okay, his daughter. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter. I see what you're saying. Okay,
and his niece.
and his niece. All right. So, and then like internationally, I thought this was an interesting quote. This is on the back of the book, The Case Against Fluoride. Sweden rejected fluoridation in the 1970s. And in this excellent book, these three scientists have confirmed the wisdom of that decision. Our children have not suffered greater tooth decay, as World Health Organization figures attest, and in turn, our citizens have not borne the other hazards that fluoride may cause. So we do have whole countries where there are healthy people that we can use as test subjects and do a compare and contrast, and we can say this Western nation didn't do fluoride, and their teeth and their kids and everybody else, they're fine, and by comparison to ours. So are there any cases, though, where you could make the argument if you looked at they didn't put fluoride in the water, and there are countries that do have tragic teeth problems because of that? I mean, are there any examples?
No. You can't point. You can have perfectly good teeth without fluoride. You don't have to swallow fluoride. That is very clear. There's a much, much stronger relationship between income levels and tooth decay than you're ever going to find between tooth decay and swallowing fluoride. The whole thing has just been so badly studied scientifically. No randomized clinical trials. For example, there was a study recently done, financed by the U.S. government, published in 2009, where they actually looked at tooth decay as a function of how much fluoride the kids had swallowed. So they got a bunch of kids, they calculated how much fluoride the kids actually ingested from all sources, toothpaste, pesticide residues, water, and so on, and found there was no relationship. There was no relationship between how much fluoride the kids had swallowed and tooth decay. And again, it comes back to the reason that fluoridation should have stopped was when they found out that fluoride's major benefit, if there's any, is topical. It works on the outside of the tooth, not
from the inside.
From swallowing it.
Not from the bloodstream.
Yes, that's right.
Right. Now, there are people who obviously have been, promoting this and that but are there politicians that are part of this dental industry that are out there trying to protect it through legislation? Have you noticed, are there senators or congressmen, as I know so often, who are former dentists? Are they moving the needle in favor of fluoridation on anything that we could resist and we could write our congressmen or senators about to object to?
It's very, very difficult to function at the state and federal level because the American Dental Association raises over $100 million a year. I think they maintain something like 20 lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and our biggest concern is the amount of federal money that is being siphoned off to promote fluoridation, and it's the CDC dollars. So on the one hand, you have the ADA spending money on public relations outfits, working behind the scenes, lobbying state legislators. They've got a real big effort at the moment to try to introduce mandatory fluoridation. A couple of years ago, they introduced mandatory fluoridation in Louisiana.
And did it pass?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
And also in Arkansas. They're trying in Pennsylvania. They try every 2 years in Oregon. In many of these states, it's been resisted, but they're having more success recently because they've got a strategy where the public doesn't find out until they're ready to vote in the state legislatures. That's what happened in Louisiana. No one knew about it. Even lobbyists for the environmental movement did not know that fluoridation was going through by stealth in the legislature.
All right. Well, hang on. Gird your loins. We'll open up the phones. And we'll take calls for Dr. Paul Connett, The Case Against Fluoride, next on Coast to Coast.